Hey there, Careblazers. Welcome back to the place where we talk about everything dementia. I am so excited about this video today because we have a special guest joining us, Kim Schauber, also known as the Dementia Caregiver Coach. So in today's video, we are going to talk about some of those challenging dementia behaviors and some of the reasons they might be happening. But before we get too deep into that subject, I want to make sure that you have joined the Careblazer family. Hit that red subscribe button on your screen. We'd love to have you. So I want to talk about some of those common challenging behaviors that caregivers are faced with, and Kim is the perfect person to be talking about these things because she is a mental health nurse as well as a holistic nurse. So Kim, can you talk about some of those challenging dementia behaviors that caregivers often are faced with?
Sure. So caregivers commonly face a lot of behavioral challenges in dementia, and my approach before going into asking a physician for medication is to see how we can manage them without medication, because sometimes the answers are so simple and obvious, they're right in front of us and we just don't know. But a lot of the behaviors that I see could range from paranoia to hallucinations, aggression, combativeness, especially during hygiene, toileting, and then you have more physical causes of behaviors like not eating. I know that's a big one that a lot of caregivers struggle with, and
yes,
it's very frustrating, and sometimes it even causes a lot of caregiver guilt. So
absolutely. I mean, and those behaviors are coming up, like you mentioned, during times that happen all the time, like eating and bathing and just every single day.
Things that we do every day.
Exactly. So it makes it super challenging for these caregivers, and a lot of them feel like they don't know what's causing this behavior.
Right.
Is there anything they can do? And a lot of times they seem to think maybe medication is the first option or the first thing they should be doing. But like you mentioned, there are some non-medication options you want to try first.
Sure.
Before we get into that, can you maybe speak a little bit about how does a caregiver even begin to try to figure out why their loved one is having these behaviors?
Sure. So if you look online, you find all types of generic advice. And that's a little frustrating to me because dementia is not a one-size-fits-all type of illness, and the uniqueness of each individual should go into what type of interventions or solutions that you're developing to manage those behaviors.
Yes. So this is a really good point. So she's talking about dementia is not a one-size-fits-all approach. In fact, like we've talked about many times, Careblazers, there are so many different kinds of dementias, right? And even though there's a lot of different, even though there's a lot of similarities across the dementias, like many of you might be struggling with challenging behaviors, there's also so many differences. So coming up with the individualized approach, absolutely necessary.
And that's what I try to do anytime I'm working with a client is I take multiple considerations into the whole picture to kind of look at the whole person from a holistic perspective, and just their background, their habits, their abilities, and kind of determine why something may be happening and what we can do about it.
Yes. So in your many years of practice, what are some of the common underlying causes of somebody with dementia starting to have these really challenging behaviors?
Sure. So I kind of gear one aspect of what I do is gearing towards the five senses to determine where a person's deficits or their functional deficits are, and if that may be causing the issue. So I know sometimes there's visual changes that happen. Hearing diminishes, taste, all that good stuff, and that can play such a huge role in the behaviors that we see. If someone can't see, it's only natural that they're easily startled all the time when you're approaching them from behind or to the side. I know I worked with one lady who I was called in because she was grabbing food off of other residents' plates in the assisted living, and come to find out what it was is that she could not see her plate sitting directly in front of her, but if you had a plate she could see yours because it was far enough out. So part of that intervention was something so simple: scoot her plate out.
Exactly. That is a wonderful example. And I love your focus on the five senses, because those are things we can't really see, or we can't really tell how they're functioning for the other person a lot of times. We have to like pause and think and start to kind of be a detective in some way.
Yeah.
Why is this person having this behavior?
Exactly.
Most of the time, it's not because they're trying to give you a hard time.
Right.
They're not actually trying to drive you crazy. There's a
Right.
reason behind it. And if we can play detective and find out those reasons,
Yep.
then we can start coming up with solutions. So that was a perfect example of how somebody who might just look like they're trying to wreak havoc during lunchtime is actually just cannot see the food in front of her. Can you give an example of somebody who, let's say, doesn't have great hearing? Many older adults, especially older adults with dementia, their hearing starts to decline.
Sure.
So how would that impact somebody's behavior?
So a lot of times with hearing deficits, you can hear an alarm clock and you process that and you recognize that's my alarm clock. I need to get up, and you turn it off and you get up, or maybe you go back to bed, but you're allowed to relax, and you're able to relax rather. And someone with dementia, when they hear that noise, that trigger, they may not be able to interpret that's the alarm, it's time for me to get up, or I can relax and go back to sleep. Instead, that can be extremely frightening to someone with dementia because they aren't able to identify that loud, sudden noise as an unharmful alarm clock.
Exactly. So things we take for granted that we know what that purpose is,
right?
All of a sudden, our loved ones with dementia might not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, our senses are the way we kind of engage with the world around us. They, keep us safe. And if we don't have them,
exactly,
we're at risk.
Yeah. And so I visit a lot of people with dementia in their homes, and what sometimes ends up happening is that they don't even hear like the doorbell ringing or somebody knocking because their hearing is so poor. And if you walk into their home without them noticing, right, it's a huge startle reflex.
It is.
Even if they know you, maybe it takes them a little bit to remember you, or they might not even remember you.
Right.
So this is why it's really important sometimes when we're coming up to somebody with dementia, before especially touching them or anything like that, making sure they physically, like, they can see you, you're in front of them, and they can hear you, because they are really prone to being startled.
Exactly. And then just to touch back on the vision, you mentioned that they may not recognize who you are. And that happens a lot, and it's really upsetting and challenging to caregivers because they think my loved one doesn't recognize me because they've forgotten me.
Yes.
And that's not always the case. It's that they, cannot interpret the image that they're seeing and make sense of it to say, that's Natalie, and she's my daughter, my sister, whatever the case may be.
Absolutely.
So.
This is such a good point. And in fact, even if their vision is intact with dementia, the ability to recognize faces can sometimes decline. And that's called prosopagnosia. But basically, a lot of times caregivers take it personally that their loved one doesn't remember them, when in fact it's the brain is not functioning properly, and it has nothing to do with them not truly remembering them. It's that the brain cannot recognize faces.
Right. And that's part of the reason I'm so passionate about educating caregivers on these physical changes, because caregiving is accompanied by a lot of emotional grief and guilt and anger and frustration and anxiety, not knowing what's coming. So the more you know, the better you can prepare, the better you can intervene, nip some of these behaviors in the bud, or at least diminish them a little bit so that you can regain some control of the situation and you're not so stressed and frustrated.
We're not saying that caring for somebody with dementia is an easy task by any means.
No.
But simply understanding the disease process can really take that caregiver stress down a couple notches.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
For sure.
So I am very passionate about helping caregivers, as that's what I've dedicated the past few years learning for. Because of that, I didn't want to feel like the ineffective nurse all the time. That was pretty that was pretty rough. So in the home environment, which is where I work now full time, I do go in and educate caregivers one-on-one and facilitate a few support groups locally for caregivers. And then I thought, there has to be more caregivers out there who could benefit from this information. So I decided to take that online to reach a lot more caregivers, to be able to help them, to be able to be an online resource. so that they can have access to the information they need from a professional source.
Absolutely. So this is wonderful. She saw a huge need in her day job and was thinking, oh my gosh, how can I help many more people? There are millions of caregivers out there struggling with this. It's really scary, actually, and the number's just growing as more and more people get dementia. So,
and everyone feels alone, but they're not.
They're not alone. There are so many of them, but it's hard because caregivers can't leave the house, right? Very often. They're stuck at home trying to take care of their loved ones with dementia, and if they do leave the house, it's a big ordeal. Who's going to watch their loved one? Does their loved one come with them? So, support groups are wonderful if you have the resources in place to be able to leave your home and get to one.
Absolutely.
But for the many of them who can't,
that's a great point.
Bringing it to the online world is where it's at, and that's what we're both doing here. So tell us a little bit about where you do your help online.
So you could absolutely follow or like me on Dementia Caregiver Coach on the Facebook business page. Or I do have a private closed group, the Dementia Caregivers Retreat, which is also held on Facebook.
So I will be sure to link to both of those resources below in my description. So if you want to find Kim later and go get some extra support and surround yourself with other caregivers in similar situations, you will be able to find her. So we've talked a lot about the senses that could be impacting a caregiver's behavior. How can a caregiver even go about finding out what senses are impacting their loved ones' behaviors? How do they even start that process?
So a lot of it would be by observation.
Okay.
You can kind of see if your loved one is startling easy when you're approaching them from different angles. You can see if they're tripping a lot or falling, losing their balance, that type of thing. You can see if with hearing it's kind of easy, because you can see that they're not hearing you, not responding to sounds the way that you or I would. And touch and sensation, as that may be a little bit more difficult to kind of observe. I know when individuals get in the shower, sometimes everybody's like, why won't my loved one get in the shower? And the reason for that sometimes is because, you have temperature, if you cannot thermoregulate. But the other thing I like to point out is that sometimes the water can be painful. Yeah. It can be painful. So when you, it is difficult to sense if they are having issues with touch and sensation, but that might be one thing you should always consider in the back of your mind too.
Yes. Very good points. And I always say before you touch, you should always tell or always give them prompting, right? Because touch is one of those things the actual sense could be like a weird sensation and pain, but also it could be vision. Maybe they didn't see you were about to touch them.
Absolutely.
Or it could be hearing. They didn't hear you and you're about to touch them. So sometimes
it could be all the above.
Yes. Sometimes they get all wrapped in together, and that might be part of the reason. But basically we're getting back to being a detective, writing down what are the most challenging situations you're faced with, what are the behaviors that your loved one's doing, and start trying to play around with possible solutions and strategies. If you think it's vision, make it a point to get in front of them before you touch them or speak to them, right? If you think it's hearing, make sure they know you're there and about to speak. So this is all really good stuff.
And then when you can also have those things tested and make sure that individuals are wearing their glasses or their hearing aids.
I really want to drive home this point. So you're mentioning sensory aids to help with some of these senses, and that is huge. So you're saying glasses, hearing aids, sometimes amplification devices, all of those.
Yeah, especially if they have, if they're not wanting to wear those hearing aids, as they commonly don't.
Absolutely. All right. So I know that the topic of senses and dementia is pretty huge, right? And we're not going to be able to cover all the goodies here in this video. But Kim has put together a really helpful kind of cheat sheet on things to pay attention in terms of senses and dementia. Do you want to explain a little bit about what this cheat sheet is?
Yeah, so just exactly like the examples that we've discussed here today, the cheat sheet just goes sense by sense and gives you kind of a guide to follow to say, what changes happen visually, what changes happen to your hearing, your taste, your smell, and how that impacts behaviors.
Awesome. And if my Careblazers want to get a copy of your cheat sheet, how can they do that?
You can post a link in the comments.
That's what I'll do. I'm going to post a link to her cheat sheet in the video description below, and you guys can click on that to be able to get access to that. And also don't forget to click on the links to join her Facebook group, follow her for her private caregivers retreat, as well as her Dementia Caregiver Coach Facebook page, where she shares a lot of interesting articles and tips. All right. What is the one thing that you hope Careblazers can take with them today after watching this video?
So one takeaway I would say is that, not underestimating the power of the non-pharmacological approach, which means you're not using medication to manage a behavior, that there are other options that you can implement and strategies you can use to get the results that you want without having to go through a doctor to get medications, and those are definitely worth exploring.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, all of the research points to exactly what Kim is saying. Medications are a last resort. That is never the first resort. We want to try to find non-medication ways to help these behaviors. All right, Careblazers, I'm so happy that you joined us today. Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
This is the very first Careblazers TV interview. What did you guys think? Do you want me to add more experts to Careblazers TV? Go ahead and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think, and I will see you all next week.